You hook the small wire S-bend of the motor shaft into the loop at the front of the fuselage, and you hold the model by the nose, and with your other hand, you start turning the propeller backward, watching the strands of rubber twist inside the paper-thin fuselage. The twisting is visible through the tissue. You can see the coil forming inside the airframe. See the rubber stranding up on itself as the turns accumulate. The model weighs almost nothing. This is the primary fact of its existence. It is almost nothing, 8 inches of balsa stick and tissue paper, and the winding motor that represents the only energy it will ever have. And yet, it contains within that near nothingness the complete logic of flight. The same physics that governs a Spitfire or a 747, expressed at a scale where a child's hands can comprehend it directly. You keep winding. The rubber motor grows tight. You can feel the resistance through the propeller shaft. Not a vague resistance, but a specific, increasing, communicating resistance that tells you the motor is approaching its limit. 20 turns, 30, 40. The balsa structure flexes slightly under the torsional load of all those coil wound strands. And this too is information. The model is at the edge of what it can hold, and launching it requires committing to the throw that will release all of this stored tension into the air in a single long diminishing burst. You face into the slight wind that is moving across the field, a park probably, or the open lot behind the school, or the grass at the edge of the neighborhood where the houses stopped and the space began. The kind of space that used to exist in American cities and suburbs as a matter of course, unbuilt and unoccupied, and perfect for this. You tilt the model upward slightly, the way the instruction sheet said, because the pitch of the launch affected the climb angle, and a model launched flat would lose altitude before it gained enough speed to generate lift. You release it with a forward push, not a throw, not a projectile launch, but a gentle committed release that puts the model into the air at flying speed, with the motor already turning, already burning through its store of potential, the propeller spinning at a rate that produces thrust from air that would otherwise have no purpose. And then, the model is aloft, and it is flying, and it is not you flying it. This is the essential fact of free flight. Once you launch it, it is on its own. You can trim it beforehand, adjust the tab on the rudder, angle the thrust line, set the wing's incidence. But once it is in the air, the aircraft is doing what the aircraft knows how to do. And your involvement is over, and what remains is the specific, undiluted pleasure of watching something you made from a flat box of balsa parts find the air and use it. The question this story is eventually going to ask is this: did Comet models fade because the hobby evolved beyond what it had always been, or because we stopped building things that required patience and launched things that required imagination? If that image is somewhere in your memory, if the feeling of winding a rubber motor into a tissue-covered fuselage is still findable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but so stories like this one don't disappear in the way that the companies and the kits and the empty lots have disappeared. What Comet model airplane and supply company built was something larger than the models themselves, and it deserves a record. Bill Bipikow and Sam Goldenberg were Chicago teenagers in 1929, which is to say, they were young men at the beginning of a disaster they had no way to anticipate. The stock market crashed in October of that year, and what followed was the Great Depression, the worst economic contraction in American history, which would by its lowest point throw 1 in 4 American workers out of employment and reduce the gross domestic product of the United States by nearly 30%. And the timing of Comet's founding right at the edge of the Depression, was either spectacularly bad or, as it turned out, accidentally prophetic. They started a model airplane supply company. Not a toy company, a supply company, which meant they were selling the raw materials and the kits that allowed other people to build the thing they were selling, which is a different kind of commerce from selling finished objects. What they were selling, in the most fundamental sense, was the activity. The thing you bought from Comet was not a model airplane. It was the experience of making a model airplane, which is a different thing entirely. The address was 2509 West Cermak Road in Chicago, which was in the South Lawndale neighborhood on the west side, a working-class immigrant community that was at that moment being tested by the Depression in the way that working-class immigrant communities are always tested by economic disasters, first and hardest, with the least margin for error. The boys who would become the customers of Comet Model Airplane and Supply Company were the sons of the people who worked in those neighborhoods, factory workers, tradespeople, the families that the Depression was grinding down month by month. They had very little money. They had a great deal of time because school let out in the afternoon and stretched into evenings that the Depression had made quieter, less commercial, more domestic than the 20s had been. The dime scale kits were Comet's answer to this combination of scarcity and time. And 10 cents for a kit that contained everything needed to build a flying model airplane. The balsa strips, the tissue, the rubber motor, the printed plan. 10 cents when 10 cents represented something real, when a family might be eating on a few dollars a week. And the price was deliberate and specific. It was the price of a child's afternoon entertainment at the movies. And Comet was arguing that what it was selling was worth at least that, and also arguing something subtler, which was that what it was selling was not entertainment in the passive sense, but engagement in the active sense. And you did not watch a Comet kit, you built it. The advertisements that Comet placed in Model Airplane News magazine in the early 1930s understood this distinction and made it explicit. They were not selling an object. They were selling the activity, the evenings at the table, the balsa smell, the satisfaction of a wing panel assembled correctly and set aside to dry, the accumulated anticipation of a project that was advancing toward the field and the launch and the glide that was the whole point. And the advertising spoke to boys who had very little and who nonetheless understood that making something was a different order of experience from receiving something. These were children of the Depression, and the Depression had been, if nothing else, a thorough education in the difference between having and making. The mail order component of Comet's distribution was not incidental. Chicago was the center of the American mail order universe. Sears and Ward's had built their empires from that same city. From the specific proposition that a catalog and the postal system could connect a manufacturer in the Midwest to a customer anywhere in the country, Comet understood this and used it, offering its kits through the mail to the boys in rural Kansas and Mississippi and Montana, who had no hobby shop within 100 miles, but who received model airplane news and who read the advertisements and who saved their dimes and sent away for the kit that would arrive in a small flat package and occupy the next 3 weeks of their evenings. The kit that arrived by mail was already a specific kind of object. It had traveled to reach you, and the traveling meant something about the value of what was inside. You did not encounter it casually in a store where other things competed for your attention. It arrived, addressed to you from Chicago, and the arrival was an event. You knew what was in it before you opened it, because you had looked at the advertisement long enough to memorize the image. Opening it was confirmation rather than discovery, and the confirmation was its own pleasure. And by the mid-1930s, despite everything the Depression was doing to the American economy, Comet was selling over 1 million wood-based airplane kits a year. 1 million kits in the worst economic decade of the 20th century. A Chicago company selling balsa and tissue and rubber motors to boys who had almost no money was selling 1 million units a year. What this tells you about the power of the thing they were selling is not something you can arrive at through economic analysis alone. It tells you something about what children wanted to do when they had the time, and even a little money, that they wanted to build things, and that the building mattered to them in a way that no passive entertainment could replicate. The staff grew to 300 employees. 300 people employed making thin balsa sheets and cutting them to the shapes that the plans called for, printing the plans, packaging the kits, shipping them to the hobby shops and the five and dimes and the mail order customers scattered across the country. 300 people whose livelihoods depended on the appetite of American children for the specific experience of building a model airplane from a flat box of parts. This is, in its quiet way, a remarkable fact about an era that we remember for its poverty and its suffering, but which was also an era of extraordinary cultural vitality in the specific dimension of making things by hand. Carl Goldberg walked into that company in the early 1930s as a young man who had already been winning model aviation competitions and who understood, at a technical level, that most of his contemporaries had not reached, why some model designs flew better than others. He was not the only designer Comet employed. The company's catalog covered a range of models that no single designer could have produced, but his contribution to the company's technical reputation was substantial. Goldberg's designs for Comet occupied the aspirational end of the catalog, the designs that serious builders purchased, not as a first project, but as a demonstration of what the craft could achieve. The model that flew correctly off the drawing board, that required minimal trimming to perform as the plan indicated it should perform, that was honest in its design in the way that good engineering is always honest. Goldberg's understanding of free flight aerodynamics, the relationship between dihedral and stability, between wing loading and glide ratio, between the thrust line and the climb angle, produced models that were not just beautiful in the abstract, but functional in the specific. They did what model airplanes are supposed to do, which is to fly. And what Comet's catalog meant, with Goldberg's designs at the top of it and the dime scale kits at the bottom, was that the company served the full range of the hobby's population. The 10-year-old with a dime in his pocket and no prior experience could find something in the Comet catalog appropriate to his situation and his skill level. The experienced modeler, who had built 50 kits over 5 years and was looking for a design that would challenge him, could find that too. The catalog was not a product line in the modern commercial sense. It was a curriculum, a structured progression from simple to complex, from inexpensive to aspirational, with the implicit argument that the person who began with the dime scale model and built carefully and learned from each build would eventually arrive at the kind of kit that Goldberg had designed. Robert Reeder, who would later go on to co-found Monogram Models with Jack Besser, worked at Comet during the World War II years as one of his first professional positions. Besser himself had passed through the Comet orbit, as had other figures who would go on to define the American model industry in its post-war shape. Comet was in this sense something more than a company. It was a training ground, a place where the people who understood model aviation deeply enough to build careers around it, develop the professional skills and the industry relationships that they would carry forward. The wartime contribution that Comet made is one of the more remarkable episodes in the company's history. With balsa wood rationed for military applications, the company's usual production lines were disrupted. The solution was a pivot. Working under contracts with the U.S. Navy and the Department of Education, Comet produced 1/72nd scale models of the actual aircraft, then in service, first from basswood, then from injection molded plastic. The purpose of these models was military identification. They were used in the training of pilots, gunners, and spotters to recognize friendly and enemy aircraft by silhouette, by shape, by the specific visual signature of each type. Robert Reeder later described their purpose as helping Americans recognize and identify aircraft flying overhead to determine if they were friend or foe. This is a genuinely interesting moment in the history of a model company. The models that Comet made were not play objects. They were training tools in a war, and their accuracy was not an aesthetic standard, but an operational one. An identification model that was wrong could contribute to the misidentification of an aircraft under conditions where misidentification could be lethal. The company that had built its reputation on the accuracy of its scale models, on the fidelity of the balsa structures to the aircraft they represented, was now being asked to extend that fidelity into a context where it mattered in an entirely different way. The building experience that Comet kits provided was at its best a slow and particular kind of pleasure. The word slow is worth emphasizing because it is the quality most at odds with what the contemporary world values and most essential to what the Comet experience delivered. You began with the plans. The Comet plan sheet, printed at full size, showing every component in its correct relationship to every other component, was the first thing you unrolled from the box, and it established the terms of the project. And everything on the plan was specific and intentional. The placement of each rib, the sweep of the leading edge, the angle at which the tail surfaces met the fuselage. You were not guessing. You were reading a document written by someone who understood what they were designing and had translated that understanding into the geometry visible on the paper.
You pinned the plan to the building board, laid the wax paper over it to prevent the wood from bonding to the drawing, and began selecting parts.
The die-cut balsa sheets yielded their components with gentle pressure, each part still connected to its neighbors by the bridges of wood that the cutting had left, and the parts you separated were recognizable even before assembly, as the pieces of something you could imagine finished. The wing ribs, each one cut to the same airfoil profile, each one a thin slice through the wing's cross-section. The fuselage longerons, the corner members that ran the length of the fuselage from nose to tail. The fuselage formers, the cross-sections of the fuselage at various stations along its length. You built the wing first in most designs. The spars went down on the plan, over the wax paper, held in place by T-pins sunk into the building board at the angles the plan specified. The ribs went on next, each one positioned over its marked location on the plan, each one verified for alignment before the glue was applied. The glue, model cement, which had a specific smell that was not unpleasant and that was entirely specific to this activity, was applied from the tip of a brush or the tip of a toothpick, a small dot at each joint, because too much glue added weight, and the model's weight was everything. Its flying performance, its ability to sustain itself in the air on the energy stored in the wound rubber motor, its capacity to find and use the slightest thermal depended on the accumulated consequence of every decision made during construction. And the sanding was its own meditation. The leading edge strip that ran along the forward edge of the wing had to be sanded to the elliptical profile shown in the cross-section diagram on the plan, rounded, not sharp, the specific shape that produced the smooth flow of air over the wing's upper surface. You held the sandpaper around a small block and moved it along the strip, checking frequently with your fingertip to feel the progress of the shaping. The correct shape was not visible before you had achieved it. It revealed itself in the feel of the correctly rounded surface under the fingertip. This knowledge, what the correct shape felt like, was not transmitted by the plan. It was developed through practice, through the accumulation of many leading edges sanded over many kits, until the fingertip knew what it was looking for before the eye could confirm it. The tissue went on next. Comet provided covering tissue, a specific thin, strong paper designed for the application, and you cut it to the shape of each panel, laid it over the balsa framework, and applied the dilute dope to the edges. The tissue tightened as the dope dried, pulling against the ribs and spars, creating the characteristic surface of a fabric-covered aircraft. Not solid, but taut, like a drum, with the structure visible beneath it if the light was rightened. This is one of the specific visual pleasures of the stick and tissue model, the transparency of the covering that allows you to see through the wing to the ribs inside, the skeleton of the aircraft visible through its skin. The dope smell was total and specific. Applied coat by coat to the tissue, each coat shrinking the covering a little more as it dried, filling the pores of the tissue until the surface was sealed and the model was ready for paint, if the design called for paint, or for launch, if it was to fly in its natural state. The smell of dope, beauty rate dope, applied with a wide soft brush in smooth parallel strokes, was the smell of almost done. The smell of the last stages of a project that had been weeks in the making. The smell of preparation for the field. Rubber motor, wound to its correct number of turns, made a specific sound as the propeller was held still against the winding. A deep, settled hum of stored energy. The model was as complete as it was going to be without leaving the ground. And what happened next was not yours to control. The balsa itself had a character that you learned to read. Not all balsa was the same. The Comet kits used good balsa, selected for the application, which meant that the parts had a consistency of density and grain that allowed the plans to specify material thicknesses without needing to account for the wide variation that poor quality balsa would have introduced. But even within good balsa, there was variation, and the modeler who paid attention learned to notice it. Rib cut from dense balsa weighed more than the plan had assumed it would weigh. A rib cut from very light balsa was structurally marginal in an application where structural integrity mattered. The experienced builder developed a practice of sorting the die-cut parts by feel before beginning construction, weighing them in the hand, feeling the grain, assessing the density, and deciding which part should go where based on what the design required at each location. This sorting was not specified in the Comet instructions. It was the kind of knowledge that you acquired from an older builder who had built enough kits to understand why it mattered. Or it was the kind of knowledge you arrived at yourself through the specific education of building models that flew wrong and trying to understand why they flew wrong. When a model pulled in one direction that the trim couldn't correct, sometimes the cause was a wing that was heavier on one side than the other because one panel's ribs had been cut from denser wood. Understanding this required having noticed, at some point, that the ribs were not all the same weight, and having understood the consequence of that difference for the model's flight. The finished model before launch had a quality that was difficult to describe to someone who had not built one, a kind of rightness, a physical coherence that announced itself when you held it at the balance point and found it level. When you felt the tension of the correctly wound rubber motor through the nose of the fuselage, when you looked down the leading edge and saw it straight. It had been made from almost nothing, thin sticks of wood and stretched tissue and wound rubber, and it had become something that expressed in its total configuration the aerodynamics of flight. The plan had contained this configuration in potential. The builder had actualized it. The distinction between the potential and the actual was weeks of evenings at the building board. The post-war era tested Comet's model in ways that the Depression had not. The Depression had been, in an unexpected way, good for model kits. It had created the conditions, the time, the reduced entertainment competition, the specific value of a cheap and absorbing activity in which the dime-scale kit could become a cultural institution. The post-war prosperity was different, and it brought television and automobiles and the suburban expansion and the consumer economy. And all of these things changed what American children did with their time and what American families spent their money on. The glow engine, introduced in the late 1940s by Ray Arden with his now famous glow plug, transformed the technical landscape of model aviation. The rubber-powered free flight model was not obsolete. It was still legal, still flown, still a competitive class in AMA events. But it was sharing the field with glow-powered models that flew higher, faster, and longer. And the glow engine captured the imagination of the hobby in the way that new technology always captures imagination, immediately and comprehensively. Comet adapted, producing glow-powered kits alongside the traditional rubber-powered line. But the adaptation was reactive rather than defining. The company that had created the dime-scale kit was now competing in a market that it had not created. The post-war generation of American boys who might have been Comet's natural customers were growing up in a country that was more prosperous than their fathers had been. A country where the discretionary income that had made the dime-scale kit's price point a genuine achievement was now less constraining, where the alternatives to an afternoon at the building board were more numerous and more actively marketed. TV arrived in American living rooms in the late 1940s and spread through the 1950s with a speed that no previous entertainment technology had matched. And its passive, immediate, scheduled pleasures competed directly with the slow, unscheduled, effortful pleasure of building a model at the kitchen table. The dime-scale kit had been invented for a world without television. In the world with television, it had to compete on terms that had not existed in 1929. The plastic revolution changed the economics of model building in ways that affected every balsa kit manufacturer. The injection molded polystyrene could be produced at lower cost than hand-cut balsa, and it could be produced with a surface finish and a detail level that balsa kits could not match for static display purposes. The plastic model kit of the 1950s and 1960s, from Revell and Monogram, companies that counted Comet alumni among their founders, was not the same thing as a Comet stick and tissue kit. It did not fly. It did not produce the same physical education in structure and aerodynamics. But it was cheaper, faster to build, and visually impressive in ways that the tissue-covered balsa model was not. The company name changed to Comet Model Hobbycraft in the early 1950s, a rebranding that acknowledged the shifting market without fully confronting it. And by the 1970s, it had become Comet Model Industries. Each name change marked a negotiation between what the company had been and what the market required it to be, between the inheritance of the stick and tissue tradition and the commercial pressure to adapt to a hobby landscape that was growing rapidly, more diverse, and more dependent on convenience. The ARF revolution that arrived in the 1980s and 1990s was the final structural change that the balsa kit industry was not organized to survive at scale. An almost ready-to-fly model arrived from the factory in a state of near completion, requiring only the installation of radio and power equipment before it was ready for the field. The experience of building was removed from the transaction. What remained was the experience of flying, which was real and valuable, but it was a different thing from what Comet had been selling since 1929, and the market that wanted the different thing was larger than the market that wanted the original. Willows, the longtime competitor that had occupied the other end of the stick and tissue kit market since the 1920s, purchased the Comet name and assets in 1998. The company that Bill Bibichkow and Sam Goldenberg had started in a Chicago neighborhood in 1929 was folded into the larger enterprise of its surviving peer, and the Comet name was absorbed into a catalog that continued to offer some version of what Comet had once offered, but without the specific character that the original company had accumulated over its 69 years of existence. 69 years from the Depression to the end of the millennium, an arc that spanned the most transformative period in American life, from the breadlines to the internet, from the Lindbergh era to the age of the World Wide Web, with the same essential product at its center: thin balsa stick, tissue paper, and a wound rubber motor. The question that the Comet story poses is not about business models or market dynamics or the inevitable displacement of one technology by another. Those are the mechanisms. The question is about what the free flight model offered to the person who built and launched it, and whether that thing is available anywhere else in the experience of contemporary childhood. The free flight model taught something that is difficult to name precisely, but that everyone who has launched one recognizes immediately when it is described: the specific experience of making something and then letting it go, of investing weeks of careful work in an object, and then releasing that object from your hands into a domain, the air that has its own rules and its own indifference to your investment. The model goes where the physics take it. If the trim was correct, if the dihedral was appropriate, if the rubber motor had the right number of winds for the field conditions on that specific day, the model climbed and turned and eventually settled into the gentle diminishing glide that brought it back to Earth, somewhere in the field, somewhere upwind of where you launched it. If the trim was right, requiring a walk across the grass to retrieve it. This is a specific kind of humility that building and launching a free flight model teaches. Not the humility of defeat, not the humility of failure, but the humility of an appropriate relationship to a phenomenon larger than yourself. You made the model. You launched it. What happened next was between the model and the air, and both of them had been doing this longer than you had. Your job was to make the model as correctly as you could, and then to let it show you what it knew. The pleasure of watching the glide was the pleasure of witnessing physics behaving as physics should behave. The model descended at the rate that its wing loading and its lift-to-drag ratio predicted it would descend. The turn was in the direction that the rudder tab had set it to turn. The propeller, which had been spinning fast at launch and was now spinning slowly as the rubber motor wound down, folded against the fuselage as the model shifted from powered climb to gliding descent, reducing drag in the way that the designer had anticipated. Everything was working. The thin balsa And the stretched tissue and the wound rubber were producing the flight that the plan had promised, and you were watching it happen from the ground. What we lose when this experience disappears from childhood is not simply the skill of building balsa models, which is a specific and transferable skill, but also a narrow one. What we lose is the specific experience of making something and then engaging with its consequences in the real world, not in a simulation, not in a controlled digital environment where the parameters are known and the outcome is reversible, but in the actual air, with the actual weight of the model, under the actual atmospheric conditions of the actual afternoon. This is experience that no simulation provides. It requires the model to be real, and the air to be real, and the physics to be actual rather than approximated. The making of the model was the preparation for this encounter. You could not buy a free flight model the way you could buy a simulation. You had to build it, and the building was what gave you the knowledge of the model, the knowledge of what it weighed, and where its center of gravity was, and how it responded to the adjustments you had made before launch. This knowledge was not academic, and it was tactile and spatial, and specific to this model built with these materials. At this time, it was the knowledge that allowed you to stand at the edge of the field and know, before you launched, whether the model was ready. If you built a Comet kit, if you have a memory of the specific smell of dope and balsa, of the thin tissue stretched over the wing ribs, of the rubber motor winding tight in your hands, leave that memory in the comments. The record of what those kits gave to the generation that built them is not preserved in corporate archives or museum collections in the form it needs to be preserved. It is preserved in the specific, felt accounts of the people who were there. And the only way it reaches the people who need to hear it is if those people choose to say so. This channel exists to receive those accounts and to honor what they represent. Return to the field. The model is airborne. You launched it 10 seconds ago, and the rubber motor is still turning the propeller, still pulling the model through its climbing spiral, and the tissue wings are catching the afternoon light in the specific way that tissue catches light, translucent, with the ribs visible as darker lines through the covering, the structure showing through the skin. The field is the same field. It always was. The grass has the smell of cut grass in the morning, the slight moisture of it under your shoes. The sky is the same depth of blue. The model is at a height that would require you to shade your eyes to see it clearly. And it is still climbing, still using the motor's last stored energy to reach the altitude at which the motor will have finished its work and the model will begin its glide. It has always been this small. The $7 kit, the dime scale design, the rubber-powered aircraft that took 3 weeks to build in the evenings after school. It has always been this small, and it has always been this large in the sky. The rubber winds down. The propeller slows. The model transitions, not abruptly, but in the way that a well-trimmed model transitions smoothly and without drama from powered climb to unpowered glide, and the sound of the propeller, which was audible from the ground as a soft blur fades into the silence of still air. Comet models made this possible for 69 years. They made it possible with a dime and a flat box of balsa and tissue